The Innkeeper by Life Sketcher. Chapter 1651, A Bad Attitude. Spending a year with inhabitants, not even pursuing their quest but just sitting tight in the jungle, was not exactly how Lex wanted to spend his time. He had wanted to complete the quest as quickly as possible, but some things were not in his control. Instead of worrying about it, he adapted his mindset. If he fixated on completing the quest as quickly as possible, this delay would have made him extremely agitated and frustrated, so instead he focused on gaining the most out of this quest, for himself and the inn. After a year in the jungle, all 500 of the staff members he had brought along were now ready to enter the Earth Immortal realm, but had held off on taking the tribulation because, well, anyone with any common sense could tell that no tribulation was going to be normal within Abaddon. He personally had accumulated quite a lot of experience in manipulating laws, and he'd finally had that meeting with Luther about creating a hell in the Midnight Inn. As it turned out, the meeting was unnecessary, for Luther was handling the matter on his own, and doing quite a decent job. He'd discovered something called conceptual torment, and it was somehow related to cryptic, overpowered jungles that ate monsters and horrors for breakfast. The galactic sovereign turtle would probably be able to help with that, considering it was a jungle and all, so Lex let Luther handle things. He would check in from time to time, but for now it was quite alright to let him take the lead. He also managed the inn remotely just fine, and found to his great relief that no major issues cropped up. In fact, his dependence on external security was beginning to decrease. The Midnight Inn, itself, had a growing number of Earth Immortals, and had a dragon with the body of a Heaven Immortal. That was, often enough, sufficient to deal with any problems that cropped up. After all, it was quite rare for celestial immortals to spend any time inside the inn, let alone cause trouble in it, especially with the tourney attracting more attention these days. His harvest from this quest was already beyond sufficient, but the quest was nowhere near complete. Even so, Lex had changed his mindset. Since there was no urgent task forcing him to rush and return to the inn, instead of rushing through this quest, he would get the most he could from it. If there was one thing he had learned from 1 year of practicing laws, it was that purpose and intention played a significant role in determining many things. Since Lex was practicing the law of supremacy, but he was clearly nowhere near being supreme throughout the universe, how could he be more in tune with his tenet? How could he improve his control of his tenet, and thus improve his power? In life, where there were many things outside his control, the way he could practice supremacy was by taking control of his purpose and intention. The system had dumped him into Abaddon and given him a role to play. He could act out that role because the system told him to do it, or he could take control of the situation by looking at it differently. He would make the most of his situation, and instead of being an instrument for the system to carry out joint quests, he would make these quests instruments to strengthen him and his inn. His inn. Not an inn given to him by the system, and controlled by his rules. His inn, controlled and managed by him using the system as his instrument. Sometimes, an alteration of perception was all it took to completely change a situation. These thoughts were a condensation of all the realizations he had over a period of 1 year, making the most out of being trapped within the jungle. As soon as he returned to the castle, he found that everything was normal, and Fenrir and Little Blue had not yet returned. Even so, he did not doubt what Nyan Cat had told him. Cayman, spread the word. The scouts are about to return, and we'll need to leave as soon as they do. I've heard that delaying our departure might trap us in the jungle for a prolonged period. The magma lion, who was hanging out with his firefly friend, immediately stood up as soon as he got the news. He was both relieved and a little dismayed. What was better than a forced vacation? But, as much as he hated the tension of being forced to fight on the edge of death every day for years on end, he also didn't like being away from a fight. After all, magma lions were not a docile race to begin with. Cayman wasn't the only one, Lex told. Orders passed quickly through the castle, and everyone quickly prepared to depart. They were not going to recreate Luther's impressive feat of dragging the castle into the jungle on a chunk of earth because, regardless of how impressive it was also inefficient. As soon as everything would be ready, the castle would return to its snow globe state and they would march out of the jungle, ready to face the challenges of Abaddon. Many saw the purple crystal on Lex's forehead, but none commented on it. After a year together, they were already used to his eccentricities, like that time his lotus tattoo started moving, and Lex started giving off a very dangerous aura. Or that time he tried growing facial hair using a spiritual technique so that he could sport a beard, but grew back hair instead. His body did weird things, and they knew that now. An air of excitement filled the castle as everyone hurried up to pack things, with only the insects who seemed a little disappointed at their departure. It was in this atmosphere that Little Blue returned to the castle, though his arrival immediately caused a halt. Although his body was still blue, he could not be called little anymore. More importantly, he carried an aura of power that seemed to transcend the concept of realms. Fortunately, the castle negated pressure by aura, or they all might have become suffocated by it. Atop his back sat a wolf, lazily looking about. The only one missing was Malfoy. Before anyone could ask, the sound of heavy panting was heard from the jungle. "Wait for me," someone yelled from deep within the jungle. But instead of a beast, what emerged from the forest was a teenaged human with blonde hair and a bad attitude. Chapter 1652, Departure. "Malfoy, is that you?" Cayman asked, looking confused. Shape-shifting was not exactly a unique ability, especially in the Earth Immortal realm. Not only could many beasts shapeshift into human form, many humans could shapeshift to take on the form of beasts. But an alternate form was ultimately an alternate form, and in it one's strength would be drastically reduced. Yes, it's me," Malfoy said, his accent suddenly becoming British, much like the insects. "Long story short, I received an inheritance which allows me to convert into other races to take advantage of their forms. More importantly, we need to get out of here. This jungle is way too freaky." Even now, Malfoy felt extreme fear towards the beings that had given him his inheritance. Their powers seemed even above the condottiere, and regardless of whether that was true or not, he didn't want to find out. "I expect a full report once we exit the jungle," Cayman said, giving Malfoy an unusual stare before continuing his preparations. It wasn't like he had anything against humans. It was more just that, in general, humans were not so strong. Even within the Reaving Dread, while there were many Earth Immortal level humans, there were almost no Heaven Immortal humans. Considering that they too were merely Earth Immortals, it might have seemed like he was judging too harshly. But it was just a simple fact. Compared to the myriad number of races in the universe, the countless beasts with heritages greater than humans, it was odd that Malfoy chose to become a human. In just a short while, the entire castle was packed up, and they were ready to depart. Lex, Luther, and the others individually saw out all the celestial-level guests and thanked them for their patronage. They even delivered many golden keys to the inn, although such keys would not work in Abaddon. While technically the key could connect any place in the universe to the inn, Abaddon specialized in isolating itself from the rest of the universe. Lex still had no idea what kind of an existence it was, since it was not technically a realm. Lex had once been inside a mirage, a place similar to a world of its own, but instead of being a minor realm, it was simply a Dow Lord's daydream. An actual world, where he went, lived for a short time, and fought countless beings, was merely a daydream. So, when it came to these high-level things far beyond his level, he did not try too hard to figure out what they were. When the time was right, he would understand. Until then, he would just accept things as they were. That didn't mean that Abaddon would forever be disconnected from the universe. One day the keys might work. But after seeing everyone off, ready to depart, they faced a single issue. Z wasn't there yet. Oh, also Little Blue didn't know how to control its aura, which would put a lot of pressure on the mercenaries and mortal and staff once the castle was retracted. But the solution for both was fairly simple. Lex sat cross-legged atop Little Blue's back, right in the middle of its four wings. The Kuanpung's back was smooth, with grooves covering its body forming patterns that formed the very characters that were used in arrays. But these characters were larger and stronger than anything Lex had seen before, as if they were a higher, deeper form of character that pointed towards certain laws. Interest flickered through Lex's eyes. Could laws also be manipulated through array characters? For that, he would just need to discover the more powerful characters, it seemed. Lex could not help but sigh at how flexible the universe truly was. There were so many ways to control laws that it was slightly absurd. It was just that ordinarily, even immortals could not use all these various means, and instead were restricted to whatever means their racial trait allowed. Lex spread his domination, subtly covering Little Blue's body and suppressing its aura, which, unsurprisingly, put up a resistance against Lex. That resistance was natural, as the Ku and Pung were a race even above dragons on the cosmic ascendance spectrum, despite their lower numbers. "Mr. Lex, the candy Mr. Big Fat Guy gave me was very yummy," Little Blue said, his cute little voice sounding very pleased. "It filled my body with a lot of power, but now I've grown too much and I can't control myself very well." "Ah, don't worry about it too much," Lex said with a chuckle. "Fenrir was like that too, once. To help it get used to its power, I used to send it out hunting. You can just go out and play with Fenrir and Sunny more often, and slowly you'll get used to things." "Okay, if you say so," Little Blue answered, feeling excited. At first it felt a little guilty because he had been gone for so long, but seeing as how Lex didn't mind, he felt relieved. From atop Little Blue, Lex retrieved the castle into its snow globe, and all the Midnight staff, excluding Lex and Little Blue, formed the Midnight Mech. The mercenaries began their march, this time completely unimpeded through the jungle as none of the insects bothered them. In almost no time at all, they approached the exit, from where the sounds of intense battle could be heard. Z and the Black Knight came into sight, revealing a heavily dented landscape as the two fought, holding nothing back. Z, naturally, had transformed into one of his combat forms, but surprisingly so had the Dark Knight. His armor was thicker and larger, with massive spikes dotted around the armor. His mount no longer looked like a steed of rock, but looked like it too was wearing black armor, and gave off a deadly aura. The fight, however, was interrupted when the armies arrived. The two separated, with Z surprised by the sudden arrival, as he had no idea they were about to leave. The Dark Knight, however, turned to look towards Lex, who looked down impassively upon the scene. "Finally, you reveal yourself," said the knight, completely indifferent to the major threat right in front of it. Chapter 1653, Lex, Master of Psychological Torture. Lex, sitting comfortably upon Little Blue's back, looked down at the knight. He was not ignorant of the knight's existence, naturally. He also knew that the knight claimed to have died once, and to have originated from Earth. But even disregarding whether such things were true or not, Lex knew that getting the knight to cooperatively reveal what he knew would be far from easy. Of course, just because it was difficult did not mean that Lex would disregard it entirely, which is one of the reasons why he finally stepped forward right now. Well, technically speaking, he was sitting, not stepping forward, but it was all the same. "I've heard you've been looking for me. I don't suppose you'd subscribe to the philosophy of walking and talking, would you? We're in a bit of a rush to leave." The army and mech stepped out of the jungle and moved aside. As long as they were outside the jungle, they didn't mind waiting a bit. After all, their subsequent series of actions had already been decided long ago. "A funny one," the knight said, his voice sounding not in the least excited at the proposition. "How marvelous. Let me guess, you're sarcastic too." Lex raised an eyebrow. He was sensing an awful lot of sass for someone who was hiding his face behind a mask. Or maybe he just felt a little upset at Lex talking down at him. In his defense, Little Blue was the one flying in the air. It wasn't like Little Blue had legs and could stand on the ground or something. "Alright, I don't mind having a little chat here. I can admit I'm a little curious about you, too. We can have a little quid pro quo. As a gesture of good faith, I'll let you go first. What do you want to talk about?" "I have a few essential questions to ask about. You see, I died before the end of a few shows I was watching. If you happen to know how they ended, it would scratch an itch that I've had for practical eons." Lex raised an eyebrow. "Eons?" "Well, considering the strange flow of time here, it was possible. Why didn't you just ask Z? He's seen Earth shows." but whatever, go ahead. Ask. That's a simple enough question. He's not from Earth. How could he possibly understand the influence that the big three had when they came out? I guess you can pretty much guess what I want to ask. Lex suddenly had a bad feeling. What happened at the end of Two Piece? Did they find the treasure? Lex felt kind of bad, because the sheer enthusiasm in the knight's voice almost made him sound like a regular teenage kid instead of an undying abomination forced to live in a hell eternally. Lex pondered whether to lie, but ultimately decided against it. The world kind of ended before that show finished, Lex admitted. The Dark Knight stumbled off his mount, his hand grabbing his chest as if he had suffered a heart attack. Lex could have sworn he heard the sound of sobbing, but decided that he must have been imagining it. What about Beach? Don't tell me it didn't end either? Oh boy, Lex muttered as he pulled his collar. Why was it suddenly getting so stuffy? It did end, but the studio kind of rushed the ending. It was so bad that I never finished it. I think Zeke could probably tell you the ending if you're really interested. The Dark Knight stumbled again, falling backwards. Lex could swear that he heard him cough out blood this time. This was probably the first time Lex genuinely felt bad for someone he was pretty sure he was going to end up fighting. What about Naruno? Wait, don't even tell me the ending. Just tell me if he ends up getting the girl he's been chasing the whole show? Cayman watched the whole exchange, thoroughly impressed by Lex. He had no context for what was happening. All he knew was that, with but a few words, Lex had defeated this formidable foe. Not that Cayman wouldn't have been able to defeat him either. It would have just required a fight. Luther, from within the Midnight Mech, began taking notes on psychological torture. He had no idea that Lex had expertise even in this field. Lex looked away. He didn't have it in him to watch the night anymore, though his spirit sense and general awareness of what was happening around him ensured that he'd see nonetheless. No, he ends up with someone else, Lex answered. The Dark Knight, the formidable undying monstrous being, collapsed into the dirt, looking upwards into the sky. Although based on the number of years in the Origin realm, he hadn't died so long ago. But due to the fluctuating flow of time within Abaddon, he had spent countless years within this barren land, imagining the various endings to his 3 favorite shows. It would not be an exaggeration to say that he had personally written millions of fanfiction episodes for all 3 shows. But he was always sure that the actual ends would have been better. Now, learning the truth, he felt it was somehow worse than the time he had spent there. Lex cleared his throat, as if he hadn't just delivered devastating news. You don't need to feel so defeated. It wasn't all bad. In fact, there were a number of other incredible shows that came out because of them. If you stop trying to attack the castle and everyone in it, I'll let you come in and watch. The knight turned his head towards Lex, and from behind his helmet gave him an incredibly hateful look, as if Lex was the reason behind his suffering. Ignoring the look, Lex continued to speak. Now that I've answered some of your questions, why don't you answer some of mine? I'll start with something easy. Where were you from? Chapter 1654, A Whim. For a few seconds, the knight remained silent. He looked pathetic and pitiful, arousing feelings of sympathy in many who watched. Lex, of course, felt nothing, because, as Z said earlier, it's the teacher with the badass eye technique who was the coolest anime character. While Lex was not an anime character, he did have eye techniques. To be specific, his left eye could see through everything, from laws to affinities to anything else in between, and his right eye could create, whether it was through arrays, or glyphs, formations or anything else. He had even unlocked karmic vision, though Lex was incredibly careful about how he used that after Jack started to stink. The point was, with his left eye, he could see through the Dark Knight. While it was entirely true that he was affected by Lex's revelations, it was also true that he was subtly using some technique with his armor to arouse sympathy in those around him, and lower their guard. Protected by domination, Lex would not be affected by that technique. If he hadn't been using domination, Little Blue's aura would have protected him. If Little Blue wasn't there, the sheer defense of his body, translated into the defense of his spirit, would have ensured that he would not be so easily affected by techniques that affect his state of mind. In short, the Dark Knight was entirely out of his league. He just didn't know it yet. Where was I from? I was born and lived in Sri Lanka, and ironically, I died from food poisoning in America. How did the Earth end? Well, it didn't really end. It was just invaded by AI who want to eradicate all humans on the planet, and then further invaded by a bunch of deities who have since established their faiths on the planet. It was now in a constant state of war between those two factions, with many of the original inhabitants having escaped as refugees, dead, or zealots of one of those faiths. Ah, so it still exists. That is good. I was worried that I would never be able to go back there again. The Dark Knight picked himself off the ground and climbed up upon his steed once more, and from his armor a black aura started to leak into the air, subtly, silently. The aura was not harmful, but he could see that the Dark Knight was preparing for something. Lex didn't stop him. He was more interested in why no one else seemed to notice, though the distinct lack of a threat from the aura was probably a big reason why. You know, there's a question I've been really meaning to ask. I hope you can help me out. What happens after death? Or, at least, what happened to you after you died? Ah, the big question. I was wondering when you would ask that one. Probably one of the most common questions asked in the universe. I was wondering why you were putting it off. Someone else finally noticed the aura, or at least started reacting to it. Came and silently began circulating the energy within his body. A few moments later, Z began honing his gathered momentum. Everyone tried to be as subtle about it as possible, but they were all preparing for a showdown. Only Lex did nothing. You know, if anyone else had asked that question, I really wouldn't have asked. But you, since you're from my home planet, I feel like I can't treat you too coldly. What happens after death? Let me show you. It was instant. There wasn't even the slightest moments build up. As soon as the knight finished his sentence, his size grew astronomically, suddenly towering over Lex. Alongside his size, his power seemed to grow as well. Though he remained firmly within the realm of Earth immortal, his entire being was now tainted by the unquenchable, undeniable hunger that was signature of Abaddon. Even at this immense size, the holes in his helmet did not let any light through, keeping his face hidden. Despite that, Lex could imagine a pair of manic eyes staring at him, filled with tightly held mania and madness. Despite his newfound power, the knight attacked with his fist. Or maybe the reason he did that was because his control over laws was tied to his armor, so a physical attack would be where it could show its greatest effect. Or maybe the insatiable hunger had driven him blind to all thought and logic. The speed with which he attacked was tremendous. Even a heaven immortal would have been unable to match such a speed. Z was ready to defend, yet he could not react in time. Of course, the defenses he already had would protect him long enough to react. Cayman might have been able to react quick enough, but the magma lion made no moves. It was as if he knew it was unnecessary. Lex, through it all, seemed unimpressed. "Stop," said Lex blandly, though his voice was tinged with domination. It seemed like he had merely said a word, but in truth, he had implemented one of his newest lawcrafts, created with the aid of Nyan Cat. This particular lawcraft mimicked the dragon race's ability to bend reality to their will. Lex liked the concept. He thought it suited his tenet nicely, so he took the concept and made it his own. Of course, such things were easier said than done, but he had learned a lot about laws in the past 13 months. The results still weren't up to the mark that he wanted, because what he was doing was not bending reality to his will. Instead, he was exacting his will upon his target, the Dark Knight. He was exacting supremacy, his latest lawcraft, named after his tenet, on the Dark Knight. "Do you know the reason why I couldn't be bothered to see you up until now?" Lex asked, looking the knight directly in his eyes, feeling like a particular character from one of the shows the knight had asked about. It was a whim. Whether to see you or not, to kill you or not, to extract your secrets from whatever has replaced your soul, or not, it's all based on my whims. And right now I feel like, you should go kill yourself. Chapter 1655, Anger Issues. Between the endless avarice that consumed the knight's very being, empowering him just as it enslaved him, between the madness of having one's sanity broken by the endless flow of time, between the crushing agony that was being molded by Abaddon into something so entirely foreign that it bore no real resemblance to who he once was, the knight felt a flicker of fear. It was instinctual. The Dark Knight, whose very existence was dictated by Abaddon, undying and unrelenting, felt a flicker of fear as he looked in Lex's eyes, and heard his command to kill himself. It was not death that frightened him. No, he had died too many times for it to frighten him anymore. No, the source of his fear was not something in himself. Instead, the fear came from whatever Abaddon had done to him. It was, as if, in the moment that Lex commanded him, he had stolen authority over the night, authority that previously belonged solely to Abaddon. The lapse was too small to matter, too insignificant to be useful. But the very existence of that lapse, and what it represented, was what caused that fear. The knight's fist, which was right in front of the Kuan Peng, frozen in midair, began to retreat slowly. The knight felt his body move, disregarding his will, as it began to gather its energy within a single point in his chest. "When you come back to life, and I know that somehow you will do that," said Lex calmly, "feel free to come find us again. Watching you locate us again and again is bound to give me some insight into Abaddon. Even if you don't tell me your secrets yourself, I will extract them from you, one by one, each time you die." Indignation. Sheer, extreme indignation filled the knight, yet he could not utter a single word. Instead, he continued to gaze at the human as the energy within his chest destabilized, and began tearing his body apart. His death was not swift, nor was it explosive. He simply crumbled apart as Abaddon's hunger satiated itself by feeding on his physical form. Once the Dark Knight vanished, there were no other enemies within sight. "Shall we continue?" Lex asked, turning towards Cayman. "Yes. Do you still want to find some ruins to explore?" "Yeah." "Got it. In that case, we follow the plan." Lex nodded, and turned to Z, who flew up to him and Little Blue. "I think you have anger issues you should work on," Z said with a tone of concern. "Anger issues?" Lex repeated, dumbfounded by the sudden statement. Well, Z wasn't wrong technically. Lex seemed to have no middle ground. He never got irritated or annoyed or just a little bit heated. He was either totally fine or explosively angry. So, yeah, he should probably work on that. But the thing was, right now, Lex hadn't shown the slightest hint of anger. He was feeling fine throughout. How could Z say he was angry? "What are you talking about?" "I was completely fine throughout." "Exactly," said Z, "you just told a man to go kill himself, and then watched as he did it. That's the kind of stuff you should only do when you're like, super angry or something. If you're totally fine throughout, then the range of acceptable behavior for when you're completely normal is way too wide. You should work on getting angry or something when you do crazy things." You're telling me I need to get angry more often?" Lex asked, amusement evident in his voice. "Don't blame me. Delma's the one who told me you tried to date a terrorist or something, so you probably need a little guidance with emotional regulation." "What? That's not what happened." "Wait, when did she tell you that?" Lex asked, shocked. "She sent me a letter before we left for Abaddon. The others got some too." "Why didn't I get a letter?" Lex asked, feeling betrayed. "Jealousy." "Yes, that's a normal emotion. I think once you get used to having normal emotions at normal times, you can probably start working on trying to pursue a stable and healthy life partner." Lex glared at Z. "I don't think you of all people should be giving me love advice," said Lex. He was referring to the fact that Z had no experience in dating. Z, however, thought Lex was referring to the fact that he had been thinking about Lex's younger sister on and off, and had thought about asking her out. Too bad she was sleeping. Z coughed, and looked away as if everything was normal. Lex snorted, and looked away too. A moment later, though, he asked, "Do you want to join the mech, or do you want to help Little Blue get accustomed to his new powers?" "Naturally, I want to help Little Blue, but since you assigned me the duty to oversee the defense of the army, I'll return to the mech." Lex merely nodded. Even now, despite there being people like Luther who seemed to be stronger than Z, none could control the mech with the skill and finesse that Z could. Lex personally hadn't tried either, nor did he intend to. It wasn't that he didn't like the mech, but it was just that he already did and oversaw too much. If he got even more involved, he would become a micromanager, and that was never a good thing. Z returned to the mech, fusing in with it, and they set off, led by the Reaving Dread. Lex and the members of the Inn weren't the only ones who had benefited from the year-long rest, and the Reaving Dread had also managed to increase their strength. So, it was with an eager heart that they quickly marched through the lands, constantly on the lookout for any locusts that might come their way. Their first step would be to get far enough away from the jungle that it was no longer visible. After that, they would go towards the ruins that had an entrance behind the waterfall. Whether they did that by finding a waterfall, or creating one hardly mattered. Chapter 1656, Hungry Little Whale. Lex was feeling good after showing off in front of the kids, but he did not let his success or growth get to his head. The Dark Knight was not nearly as weak as Lex made it appear to be. The fact that his strength had been rising evenly to match Z meant that either he was holding back, or he was growing rapidly. The fact that he could continuously come back to life also played in his favor a great deal. Logically, it made more sense to seal and imprison him than kill him, but Lex had not been lying when he said he wanted to study the Dark Knight. Before killing him, Lex had left a mark in his spirit and hoped to follow it to see what happened to it. While it worked initially, and Lex was able to track his spirit as it evaporated, the experiment quickly came to an end as something cleansed his existence by marinating it in with the avarice of Abaddon. Facing the knight was a calculated risk he was taking, but of course he could never let his opponent know that Lex was taking him seriously. Making the knight assume that Lex was arrogant due to his strength was a purposeful act on Lex's part so that he would never actually anticipate the depth of the precautions Lex was taking. A lifetime of ending up in an immense amount of trouble had taught him exactly how to avoid being caught unaware as much as his own abilities allowed. Despite the relatively comfortable time they spent in the jungle, everyone was happy to leave it behind, for more than one reason. As soon as they were far enough from the jungle where it was no longer visible on the horizon, the flow of time in Abaddon once again began to fluctuate, changing from one moment to another. Generally, though, it was much faster than the flow of time in the Midnight Realm. The absence of the jungle also brought back the many dangers of Abaddon. There was no warning save what his instincts gave him, meaning Lex had plenty of warning. Even then, he did nothing. The ground erupted, revealing a large tentacle made entirely of bones, reaching out into the sky like a tower. Though the tentacle had no mouth on it, as far as Lex could see, it screamed before curling and then throwing itself towards the mech like a whip. The mech, under Z's command, was more than ready to react to such an attack. But this was the time for Little Blue to get used to his power. Lex gave him no instructions, mainly because Lex had no idea what a Kuan-Pung was capable of, or what its power entailed. When Little Blue saw the bony tentacle, instead of feeling intimidated by its size or power, he felt a giddy energy. He was finally going to fight too. Fenrir had too many cool fighting stories, but Little Blue had none. Now, it too, could brag back at the inn. He extended his four wings, spreading them out completely, and let the entirety of his aura explode. Lex withdrew domination, so as to not interfere. He wanted to see how a Kuan-Pung's aura differed from Dragon's Might. Dragon's Might was an incredible and powerful suppressive force, as a manifestation of the dragon's high position in the cosmic ascendance spectrum, as well as the dragon's individual power. It could freeze, intimidate, and pressure any who felt it, not to mention that it often acted as an instrument through which a dragon could display their power. It was one of the three most iconic things about a dragon, alongside their dragon breath and dragon scales. So when Little Blue spread its aura, Lex expected some of the same. To a degree, he was right. The majesty of Little Blue spread across the land through his aura, declaring it a superior being in every conceivable way, a predator with no equal, where all things were its prey. Simultaneously, everything within his aura was marked as its target, and it had to consciously choose to leave out the mercenaries, the mech and Lex. Then, Little Blue opened his mouth. Lex was expecting an attack of some kind, akin to dragon's breath. Instead, it sucked everything in, leaving behind only emptiness in its wake. Everything that the light touched, and everything the light didn't touch, all became Little Blue's target, changing their very state of existence into pure energy that was pulled into the Kuan-Pung's mouth. Lex, even with his eyes' ability, could not see what happened because there was no light, no energy, nothing which entered his eyes. Instead, with his tenet, he barely sensed the rippling of the laws as they acted in a way he had never seen before. A moment later, when Little Blue closed its mouth, everything returned to normal, but the entire landscape had changed. The tentacle was gone, leaving no sign of its existence behind. The ground, too, was gone, leaving only a massive hole that seemed to extend into dark depths beneath them. Fortunately, it seemed that Little Blue's range was not massive, as the hole extended only 50 miles, 80 kilometers, in a circle around them, though its depth could not be gauged by Lex. Little Blue retracted its wings, and let out a tiny burp that caused a rumbling in the vacuum around them, for there wasn't even any air there. "You should be more careful with what you eat," Lex said, maintaining a facade of calm regardless of how surprised he was. "Everything in Abaddon is cursed. It wouldn't do for you to get indigestion, or perhaps something even worse, constipation." "Sorry," Little Blue said in its cute little voice. "I'll try something else next time." "Good. Let's carry on," said Lex, allowing Little Blue to continue flying forward. Most others were just as shocked, if not more, than Lex. Though, that shock was accompanied by excitement. Who wouldn't want such a formidable ally on their side? Only Cayman showed no surprise or shock whatsoever. After all, their mercenary group also had a Kuan-Pung in it, so he already knew some of what a Kuan-Pung could do. The thing that the Kuan-Pung were most well known for, however, had nothing to do with combat. Well, technically it helped a lot with combat, but that wasn't its primary purpose. Kuan-Pung were most famous for their speed, able to traverse great distances with a single flap of their wings. Even teleportation itself was not as fast as a Kuan-Pung. Chapter 1657, Waterfall. Once again restraining Little Blue's aura, which was now even more unstable after its little snack, Lex began to think about how abnormal everyone around him was. It kind of made sense. His own experiences were so abnormal that even those around him who were initially normal slowly became abnormal. But, this was a little too much, right? How had a baby whale that had merely been a pro bono guest ended up as a Kuan-Pung which could devour everything in its path? Of course, he knew the exact sequence of events that had led up to such a thing. But, as he thought back to that massive hole, he could not help but wonder at the absurdity of it all. Honestly, he was pretty sure that as long as they had enough time to grow, Lex would never need to worry about the insecurity ever again. Between Kuan-Pungs, sentient spaceships, living swords, a badass lich, countless workers with overpowered bloodlines, 2 sovereigns, some unknown worker who was all but set to discover his Tao or something like that, himself and the many other abnormal people living in the inn, he almost felt bad for anyone who would become their enemy. So many of them seemed to reach above their power level. Heck, Lex himself was capable of fighting heaven immortals now, and he had a feeling that Little Blue's power wasn't restricted to realms the way normal cultivators had abilities limited to the power level of their own realm. Fighting above one's level shouldn't be so common, yet it was practically a norm at the inn. This did not make him feel self-assured, though. No, it only made him think about all the powerful organizations that controlled a major realm, if not more than one. With all their resources, not to mention the incredibly long period of time that they had existed for, Lex could not help but imagine how many powerful immortals they had gathered over the years. Even if they only trained one immortal who could fight above their power level every 10,000 years, since they had existed for millions if not billions of years. Lex frowned. It wasn't like there was some kind of competition and he was trying to beat them. he was just trying to understand the power scale of the universe. The only real barrier he felt that was uncrossable was that between a Tao Lord and an immortal. That probably meant that all the true elites of the universe, those who were not already Tao Lords, were probably all at the peak of the celestial realm. It was likely that only once he reached such a level, he would get in touch with others who broke the norms as frequently as he did, and he'd truly be able to test how special he was among the elite of the universe. One of the reasons why Lex suddenly got lost in his introspection was Little Blue's devastating attack. He didn't even understand how it worked or what had happened. Yet when he thought about whether or not he'd be able to resist it, his instincts told him that he would. It was not something he wanted to test, at least within Abaddon, but it put a fine point on just how abnormal Lex himself was, even compared to everyone at the inn. Yet the more he felt like this, the more he needed to remind himself that the universe was a vast place, and the moment he started getting arrogant, someone would put him in his place. Time and time again, he needed to remind himself to not get overconfident. Considering the fact that he was constantly dealing with powers far beyond his level, a single mistake is all it would take to mess things up. "Alright, this is far enough," said Lex, looking at the landscape around them. They were crossing massive glaciers, which meant that it would be incredibly easy to create a waterfall, though they could have done that even if there was no water available whatsoever. Lex deployed the castle, and the mercenaries made their way inside while the inn staff exited their mech form. All of them retreated within the castle, including Lex, who found himself a room and sat down in a meditative pose. Clones weren't really his thing, but if he tried hard enough, he could still create a temporary clone with decent enough power. The reason he was sending a clone was because Cayman had made it clear to Lex that neither he nor the others would be venturing into ruins anytime soon unless they determined that it was impossible to find the chalice without doing so. The weight of the knowledge they had attained, in his own words, was a constant burden that they were unable to overcome, nor could they get used to. Lex, who was constantly plagued by the influence of the stench that Jack was exposed to, could sympathize with their feelings. Typically, sending a clone out of sight of the group would result in it being teleported somewhere different altogether. But this particular set of ruins were special since the entrance was always behind a waterfall, so theoretically, Lex shouldn't end up anywhere else. Lex's clone left the room and walked to the gate, where Cayman was waiting for him. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes. If everything goes well, I should gain some insight into how Abaddon works. Maybe that'll help us find the chalice sooner." "Well, I hope your theory is right. At the same time, I feel kind of bad for you. The price of knowledge is not so easily paid in the graveyard of secrets." Lex merely nodded. There was no point in arguing over this topic anymore. The two of them ventured out, and only a couple of miles away from the castle before Cayman decided it was a good enough location. They quickly excavated the ice, forming a fall that was about 100 feet, 30 meters, tall, leading to a small lake. Behind the fall, Cayman dug out a riverbed in the ice, starting from another massive lake that he filled by melting the ice. In just a few minutes, a flowing river was created, leading to a waterfall. Cayman would continue to keep the water flowing for as long as Lex's clone was in there. Who could say what would happen to the ruins if the water disappeared? Not them, so it was best not to take any chances. Chapter 1658 Ancient City. Lex's clone stood at the edge of the waterfall, observing the crystal-clear liquid falling down with loud fury. On Earth, glacier water was usually considered one of the purest sources of water available. Here, glacier water held residual taint from some long-forgotten contamination, making the water extremely aggressive in nature and dangerous to touch, not that Lex was considering bathing in that water or something. Behind the waterfall, an arch was visible, coincidentally the perfect size to allow Lex through. But through the arch, he could only see shadows, as if it led to an unlit path. Carefully, so as to not disturb the waterfall, Lex made his way around the water, and approached the arch, stepping in. Fortunately, nothing crazy or abrupt happened. The arch leading back to the same waterfall was still behind him, and just to be sure, he stepped out and back in a few times. The arch stayed in place, and nothing in the surroundings changed. Once his experiment was completed, Lex stepped into the arch and began to explore. It was dark, but the darkness wasn't mystical. Instead, it was because he seemed to be inside a large cavern. From the tip of his finger, he summoned a faint light, illuminating the cavern. It looked entirely natural, if a little large, with countless stalactites and stalagmites. Somewhere in the distance, Lex could hear a drop of water dripping down into a puddle, but that wasn't what Lex was paying attention to. Right in front of him, as if concerned that he wouldn't have been able to find it, was a large building of some sort, with spires around it, reaching the very roof of the cavern. There was a winding path that led to the entrance of the building, as if that wasn't suspicious at all. This didn't look much like ruins, even if Cayman had claimed that the ruins were well preserved. Lex began to approach the building, keeping his senses spread wide on his surroundings to spot any and all abnormalities. Yet this was the most ordinary cavern Lex had ever come across, with no other surprises. Though that was to be expected. Cayman had said that all the knowledge he learned was depicted in murals that filled the actual ruins. If he completed the ruins task, he could retain the knowledge he had gained, and if he did not, he would forget. But Cayman also felt that the knowledge here was contaminated, for even after forgetting the knowledge, a fragment of the weight it caused stayed with Cayman, and the others, causing a pressure that they still hadn't been able to overcome. That was the primary reason why Cayman refused to enter another ruin. The weight of the knowledge he had learned and forgotten still weighed on him in an unbearable fashion. Of course, the weight of the knowledge held in the ruins seemed to be of the most basic level, with citadels holding even greater secrets. But since Lex had no access to citadels, he'd make do for now. All the way until the entrance of the building, Lex encountered no obstacle of any sort, nor did he sense any malicious entity. It was, as if, the existence of the building automatically turned this into a safe space. Or maybe it was so dangerous that even the monsters of Abaddon had learned to stay away. Lex took many precautions, just in case something went wrong, but he pushed open the door of the building and faced no problem. The interior, though, was like a totally different world. It looked like Lex had returned to ancient Greece. Blinding sunlight shone down from the sapphire sky, revealing the breathtaking sight of a city sprawled across a hillside. Marble columns rose like frozen music, supporting grand temples etched with golden runes, and wide stone streets bustled with robed figures speaking in a tongue lost to time. Olive trees lined the paths, their leaves shimmering in the warm breeze, and distant lyres sang sweet, haunting melodies that drifted from open courtyards. It was as if the door had torn a hole in time itself, revealing a living echo of an ancient city, untouched and eternal. Just as Cayman had said, the ruins were remarkably well preserved. The air itself felt different, as if it too was from a different time. From where he stood, Lex saw no murals, but he had no doubt that such a vast city was filled with them. A marble staircase led down from the door that seemed to open in the middle of the sky, to the center of a semicircle stage in the base of a large open-air theater. He took the scene in and stepped down. Nothing remarkable happened, save that the air felt so fresh that Lex got goosebumps. One step after another, he descended the staircase, right up until he stepped on the stage. From there, Lex noticed three things. He noticed a path, yet another path, starting from the theater stage and leading to the exit, no doubt taking Lex wherever he needed to go. The second thing he noticed was a mural. It was not visible from the stairs, but as soon as he stepped on the stage, he saw that the entire stage wall was actually a mural, revealing a complex scene. It would probably take a bit of observation to decipher. Unfortunately, Lex could not focus on that, because most of his attention was diverted on the third thing he noticed. Cayman told him that each set of ruins gave out a challenge. Completing the challenge would allow them to retain the knowledge they had gathered. Lex hadn't really thought about how the challenge would be given out. Now, he had an answer for the question he didn't ask. Right in front of him, hovering in the middle of the air, was an illusory blue rectangle with the words "Initiate Challenge" written on it. For some reason, Lex could not help but think that the font on the text bore a great resemblance to the font of his own system. Chapter 1659, First Mural. Lex did not immediately jump to any conclusions. Even though there was a similarity, there were significant differences as well. To start with, instead of a notification appearing in his own personal field of view, this was more of a projection of a prompt. From what he could tell, he would need to interact with it in some way to actually begin, or rather initiate the challenge. As far as he could tell, anyone who was there with him would have been able to see the projection as well, so it was not specific to him. There was no notification sound that accompanied the appearance of the projection, though the fact that it appeared dead in front of him, and would move wherever he looked, meant that he wouldn't miss it. If he closed his eyes, then the projection appeared within his spirit sense, and if he sealed that it appeared directly in his mind, ensuring that any race, regardless of their senses, would have been able to interact with it. Lastly, and most significantly, the font was only similar, not identical. Unlike the system notifications, which appeared in English, the text on this projection was written in some ancient language that Lex could inherently understand, independent of his universal translator. Instead of reacting to the projection, Lex turned towards the mural because there was another interesting thing he noticed. Upon the mural loomed a grand figure, half man, half serpent, his ancient eyes brimming with celestial knowledge. Lex almost felt as if the figure was looking at him through the mural, just as Lex was looking at him upon the mural. His upper body was muscular and weathered, clad in flowing robes marked by sacred symbols. In fact, the symbols almost felt like array characters to Lex. The reason he felt they were almost like array characters, and wasn't sure, was because the memory of those characters kept escaping his mind, slithering out as if they were escaping imprisonment. Long white hair draped over his shoulders, and his hands held out in front of his chest seemed to imprison a glowing orb. It was exactly that orb which attracted Lex's attention, because it was something he had seen often on Earth. It was the symbol of yin and yang, also known as the taiji. In the mural, the taiji was also surrounded by a total of 8 sets of characters, with each set made of 3 straight, horizontal rows containing either a complete line, or a line broken in 2 from the middle. Lex didn't recognize the lines, but he felt that the image of it was powerful, as if merely viewing it had added weight to his very existence. It was an odd feeling, the weight. Lex almost felt like the weight was a good thing, for its presence would help him build a stronger, firmer foundation for his cultivation. At the same time, he felt like if he could not handle the weight, then the weight would quickly become a curse, even going as far as killing him. Lex turned his attention back to the figure. His serpentine lower half coiled beneath him, its dark, scaled length rooted in the earth like the axis of creation. Golden characters, once again reminding Lex of array characters, drifted around him like spirits, each representing some great yet unknown power. The half-man, half-serpent was clearly the central character of the mural, but he was not the only one in it. There was another character, but hidden behind white clothes and a pink veil, nothing of her could be seen save her eyes, which looked very human, and very similar to the serpent man. Lex, of course, had no idea as to the gender of the character, and merely assumed it was female due to the veil. It could very much be a guy as well. The two of them stood in a deep, threatening-looking valley, with dark clouds hanging overhead. It was not stated clearly, but the whole scene and setting of the mural made it look like the two characters were in immense danger. Some unspoken danger was lurking just around the corner, threatening to defeat them. Simultaneously, it also seemed like the serpent man had a great purpose which he needed to complete. Lex studied the mural for a while, and the longer he looked the more minor details he had previously missed started to become obvious. For example, the shadows cast by the two characters did not correspond to their bodies. For example, the mural was well lit, but the dark clouds should have made the mural dark. For example, Lex closed his eyes and turned his attention away from the mural. For every little bit of detail he learned, the slightest bit of weight was added to his soul. For now, the weight was all but insignificant, but Lex wanted to save as much of his capacity as possible. Who knew how many murals he would encounter? While learning the minute details of the mural might aid him in uncovering some hidden secret, for now he was content with learning the major, overarching theme or story of each mural. Lex raised his hand and gently pressed on the Initiate Challenge option on the projection, and felt a pulse of power travel from the projection into the city around him. The text in the projection began to fade, and new text began to replace it. Lex got goosebumps as he read it, though he didn't quite understand why. It was as if he was walking on a very delicate sheet of ice, and the slightest misstep would cause it to break, making him fall into the abyss below. The text read: Reality and fantasy. Heaven and earth, hell. Order and chaos. A perfect balance is an illusion, and yet imbalance is the natural order of the universe, if only because change is constant. But the illusion of chaos and imbalance are only an illusion, for the universe prefers balance. See through reality and fantasy, identify heaven and the earth, and bring balance between order and chaos. Use only the characters from the Book of Changes. Chapter 1660, Wrongness. Lex only just finished reading when the projection changed, taking on the shape of a large, worn time. On the cover, in the same ancient language, were written the words Book of Changes. Lex had to close and rub his eyes. The sight of the Book of Changes alone caused a huge weight to fall upon Lex, about 1% of his total capacity to bear, if his guess was correct. That was, by far, the greatest weight he had accumulated so far. As if that alone was not enough, Lex's eyes felt a great strain on them, as if the sight was too much for him to see. Both the sensation of weight and the strain quickly vanished, yet the urge to rub his eyes did not fade. Fortunately, when he opened his eyes again, more weight did not fall on his soul. He opened the book carefully, ready to close his eyes at the slightest hint of more weight, but nothing happened. Instead, he only saw a large, weathered page with a single character on it, as well as a simple description of the characters used underneath. He turned the page and saw more characters in the following pages, with nothing else in the entire book. The whole book was merely 64 pages, which made the characters easy to remember. The issue was that each character was complex and abstract, their uses not so simple or straightforward. He had no idea how to use them, but that would likely become clear as he proceeded through the city. Hopefully. Once he was sure that he had memorized the characters, Lex left the stage, following the path outside the theater. At least the city looked beautiful. He just had to be extremely careful about what he saw and did. He didn't want to accumulate unnecessary weight. He finally understood why Cayman was so cautious about it. As soon as he exited the theater, the path led through a large neighborhood of large, well-decorated buildings. Since the path did not lead into them, Lex did not try entering and exploring either. He had thoroughly understood how the weight of knowledge could be a curse or a blessing, and pushing things was a great way of leaning towards being cursed. After all, he did not know how much weight he would accumulate as he walked through the ruins. As he passed one marble arch after another, admiring immaculate marble sculptures of things such as trees, flowers, animals, and even geographical features, such as volcanoes, he silently observed the entire ruin, and more importantly, the space of the ruin. His main reason for coming to the ruins was to verify how Abaddon treats this place. The ever-changing, ever-fluid state of Abaddon made it all but impossible to find something within. The ruins, however, seemed to be significant points around which the space of Abaddon was fixed, at least according to what he was told by Cayman, just as the jungle was a fixed point. If he learned enough about these fixed points in Abaddon to recognize their signatures and find them, then their chances of finding the chalice would increase drastically. At least it would be far more likely than their current plan of hoping they stumble onto the chalice. So, he employed his mind to the utmost, absorbing everything about the ruins and the space around it as he could, while remaining careful not to stray from the path. It was as a result of such extreme concentration that Lex noticed the first anomaly. It was not an anomaly with space, or Abaddon. Rather, it was a wrongness about the ruins, about the city, that could neither be explained nor clearly identified. Yet its influence, while subtle, was undeniable. Upon examining the city for a while longer, Lex realized that one source of the wrongness was the stage he had just come from, while another was his destination along the path. It seemed like a massive public well. Lex was reminded of the words of the challenge. He had to see through what was real and what was fantasy, identify heaven and hell, and bring balance between order and chaos. Could it be that the wrongness was the imbalance? That would make sense. He had never felt something like this before. In fact, if he hadn't been paying attention, he might not have even noticed. Lex paused for a moment, considering whether to turn back and return to the theater to correct the imbalance there, if he could. He decided it would be for the best and turned around, yet the path had disappeared. Lex had been walking on a paved road from the moment he entered this city, and though there was no obstruction preventing him from stepping off of it, out of caution he decided against it. Now learning that the path disappeared behind him finally added a bit of pressure in this otherwise peaceful environment. If there were no threats of unusual occurrences, it just wouldn't feel like Abaddon. Despite his desire to go back and fix the first imbalance, Lex decided to go against it. Just this once, his performance would have to be less than perfect. He resumed his journey, entering the rectangular building that also served as a public well. Once inside, he noticed that the well was rectangular, like the building, and there were steps on each of the 4 sides descending ever deeper into the water. There were also paved paths, as if for large animals to enter into the water, or more likely, to approach the water and drink from it. As it happened, there was another mural, painted right on the surface of the water. While the concept was beautiful, Lex's inner gamer told him there was probably some secret hidden in the water. Yet for once, Lex behaved. There was no going after universe-grade secrets that could cause envy in the masses. Instead, he simply studied the mural. This time the veiled lady seemed to be missing. Instead, the serpent man sat languidly on a throne, holding a scepter with the Taiji acting as the head of the scepter. Chapter 1661, Concept of Power. The serpent man's robes had not changed, for he appeared majestic and grand regardless of what he wore. But while in the previous mural he seemed solemn while facing some unseen danger, this time he was almost bored. The throne he was seated on was at the head of a courtroom, and what a grand courtroom it was. It was incomparable to anything Lex had seen, for it wasn't gold and jewels that decorated the halls, nor did marble make the tiles. Instead, it was a court that spanned, well, Lex chose to view it as galaxies, but he had a feeling it was meant to represent the universe. The planets and stars, and realms of all sizes had been arranged to form pillars that held up the roof which, in the context of the mural, must have been heaven. A carpet made of cosmic dust was sprawled down the center of the hall, though upon closer inspection one would notice that each particle of dust was a galaxy of its own. It was a good thing that most of the throne was blocked from view, or else Lex could not have even imagined what it would be made out of. The entire court, Lex realized, was a formation on an absolutely unbelievable scale, and it was very much needed, for the serpent man wasn't alone there. Countless blurry figures filled the courtroom, kneeling before the serpent man. As soon as he got a gist of what the image contained, Lex looked away, lest he start noticing the finer details of the mural. Instead, he focused on the wrongness that pervaded the public well, and tried to understand it more deeply. Fortunately, doing this did not add any weight to his soul, so he could really dedicate himself to this task. The issue was that he did not understand the 64 characters too well and could only vaguely refer to their descriptions according to the Book of Changes. To then try and figure out how he would use those characters to correct the wrongness was not going to be an easy task. He finally understood what Kamen meant when he said that the challenges were not easy to do, which is why they mostly avoided them altogether. Lex sat down cross-legged, losing himself as he diverted most of his attention towards solving the problem, so much so that he didn't even notice the difference in the flows of time. Within the ruins, his clone experienced an entirely different flow of time, one much slower than the outside. That meant that as Lex lost himself in his contemplation, entire days passed around his main body, whereas only a few hours passed for his clone. Fortunately, it was not the other way around, for his processing speed was heavily dependent on the flow of time his main body experienced, not the clone's. So focused was he on his task, Lex had no idea that the castle had started to attract attention, and had already suffered a few rounds of attacks. The defenses of the castle ensured that there was nothing wrong, but the waterfall outside the castle needed defending, which was an arduous task. As if that wasn't bad enough, if Lex took more than just a few days in the ruins, then night would descend. Defending the waterfall at night, with those mysterious enemies who were specifically hunting Lex, would be an additional challenge. No one complained though. The mercenaries, better than anyone else, understood the immense risk Lex was taking all so he could help them. When Lex's clone finally opened his eyes, many days later, he remained lost deep in his thoughts for a few moments. His eyes, Lex realized, looked identical to the vision that had spread throughout the universe when he became an Earth immortal. It was as if those eyes could see all the secrets of the universe, and held endless answers. But as his awareness returned, so too did his eyes return to normal. His long duration of contemplation allowed him to come to a few conclusions. Some were regarding the space of the ruins, and how Abaddon treated it. Most of his realizations, however, had to do with arrays. It was no surprise that the 64 characters he had learned could be used to form arrays. What did surprise him was that he sensed that these characters, they were far more powerful than any character he had ever used. When he learned about arrays to begin with, he also learned that arrays theoretically had no upper limit in power. That theory was never realized. The concept was that since the arrays directly use the energy of the universe, an array that was diverse and properly curated could demonstrate any level of power. In reality, a few things caused a bottleneck to the actual power an array could demonstrate. The fact that the type of energy used to power arrays was random played a significant role. At lower levels it didn't matter, but at higher levels of power, a sufficiently powerful energy type was required. A weak energy type used to power an array would obviously, at most, demonstrate a power level at the early levels of an Earth immortal. Besides energy type, the rarity and power of the array characters also made a huge difference. Lastly, the fact that most array characters were just a denomination of laws representing a single aspect of a law meant that arrays could never match the true versatility and raw power of laws. It was only recently that Lex discovered some characters that were, well, they represented larger aspects of laws. That presented the possibility that some characters might even contain whole laws. At first, when he learned these 64 characters, he assumed that these characters were as such. They either represented a large part of, or possibly even an entire law. But after days of contemplation, Lex realized that he had absolutely no concept of what they represented. It certainly wasn't like any law he had felt before, so maybe they were the laws that heaven or celestial immortals could sense. Or maybe it was something else entirely. That was irrelevant. What was relevant was that the power these characters held, once again, Lex had no way to conceptualize it. This was far beyond his scope of knowledge. In that case, the only way to be sure was to try it out. He held out his finger, as if it was a pen, and began to draw an array character like he had done so long ago, when he started using arrays for the very first time. Chapter 1662, The Gift of Fire. Arrays used the energy of the universe to power themselves, but drawing the character required the user's own spiritual energy. Back when Lex started out, he had two great obstacles: his drawing speed, since each character needed to be perfect, and his energy reserves. Neither of those had been a problem for Lex for a long time, yet as he began to draw the character from the Book of Changes, he found that the energy was practically pouring out of him as he drew it. Yeah, these are probably supernormal characters, Lex said as he completed the character. Fortunately, he didn't need to draw an entire array just yet, simply identifying the correct character was enough. After a long time of observing and monitoring the situation, Lex eventually discovered that the wrongness seemed to have a certain flavor to it. As it happened, the description of the characters in the Book of Changes described the perfect character to correct it. Resolving the situation wasn't difficult, it was more about identifying the problem to begin with. Once the character was complete, it resonated with the land, pulling energy that Lex immediately recognized as chaos energy. The result, however, was not massive. The wrongness simply faded away, just as the character did. At first, Lex thought that was it, and was about to move on, but then he noticed movement. It wasn't in the city, rather the mural seemed to be moving. The characters in the scene were rearranging themselves, and the serpent man sat up straight in his throne as if his mother had told him off for his bad posture. Suddenly, the meaning of the mural changed. Instead of an overpowered being holding court, attending to his subjects, the scene depicted the serpent man as a great sage, teaching his disciples with the universe itself as the drawing board. Lex did not look too closely. Getting the general gist of the mural was enough. What was most important was that the initial meaning of the mural had been deceptive. Only after correcting the wrongness did the truth reveal itself. Was this what the challenge meant by looking through reality and fantasy? His curiosity about the changes to the mural once again reminded him of the first mural, and he wondered what the real mural might have looked like. But curiosity did not mean that he would stray off the path. He investigated the scene once more, trying to determine if he could sense any other abnormalities. The only wrongness he detected was still coming from the theater. Though he had no intentions of returning, he tried to see if he could correct it from where he stood. Since he had already analyzed the wrongness, all he needed to do was draw the correct character. He turned around and drew another character, once again losing an immense amount of energy, but just like last time, as soon as he drew the character, it resonated with the space, and then the wrongness faded alongside the character itself. Lex nodded, and then sat down to meditate for a while. His clone's energy reserves were nowhere near as limitless as Lex himself, and he needed to ensure that he retained as much energy as possible. If the energy level becomes too low, the clone itself might destabilize. With a basic understanding of the ruins and the challenge established, progress through the rest of the ruins was much faster, though it wasn't exactly fast. Every time he went from one section of the city to another, he would sense another wrongness, and would find another mural. After a few days of meditation, he would be able to resolve the situation without much of a hassle. Through the murals, Lex found that the story followed the serpent man, though the female from the first mural never appeared again. The more it was like this, the more he regretted not being able to see what the actual mural showed. He had a feeling that the first mural, even among the others, was especially important. The two sets of murals seemed to show two entirely different stories. The false murals depicted a tale of the serpent man's incredible power. He seemed to build worlds with a wave of his hand, and create laws with a flick of his tail, and ruled as a prideful yet powerful leader. To be honest, there was nothing wrong with that. It wasn't as if any of the murals depicted him as a tyrant or anything. But the truth seemed somewhat different. The same pictures underwent changes, somehow seeming much more detailed, not that Lex focused on the details. Instead, he learned the story of a sage who walked through the universe, waving his hands to mend broken worlds. The laws of the universe seemed weakened, and had no strength to uphold the integrity of the universe, so he created formations, laying the groundwork for how the universe would work. Of course, that was merely Lex's interpretation at a glance, without taking in the deeper details. Moreover, even though he saw it, and even though the weight of the knowledge felt like it was the undeniable truth, Lex did not believe it. He did not believe that there was a being so powerful that it laid out the foundations for how the universe would work. If such a being existed, then it would be the ultimate ruler, to this day, for this was a power level far beyond anything a mere Tao Lord could achieve. The stories continued, and showed how he nurtured civilizations and taught them how to live. There was even a picture of him handing fire to what looked like humans, and that instantly caused Lex to think of the legend of Prometheus from Earth. Lex wasn't an expert in Greek mythology, but he was pretty sure none of the other murals matched his stories or legends. He could confirm later on. For now, he continued to view the murals. Chapter 1663, A Change. The trend suddenly changed from the 65th mural. By then, Lex had used all the characters from the Book of Changes once, and had gained a basic understanding of it. At the same time, he had spent months simply going through those few murals. He didn't know what would happen if he used the wrong character to try to fix the wrongness, and it wasn't something he wanted to find out, either. As a result, he had gained a deeper understanding of how to use the characters, at least in the context of addressing the wrongness that filled the ruins. Lex also had a feeling that these characters might actually come in handy in helping him navigate Abaddon, but that was something for later. Once he reached the 65th mural, the wrongness evolved. In fact, it could no longer even be called wrongness. Rather, there was simply a presence. Now it was up to him to decipher if that presence was reality or fantasy, for if he changed it, it would definitely affect the mural. yet was it even needed? What if the mural he saw to start with was the correct one? The difficulty of the challenge had suddenly increased, but correspondingly, the information in the murals had also become more significant. The Serpent Man, who up until now was shown as a being of unquestionable might and power, was suddenly faced with something extremely formidable. The mural was painted from the point of view of the item, or perhaps being, that the Serpent Man was faced with, so it was hard to tell what it was exactly. Within his pupil, however, Lex saw a hint of gold reflected, though he dared not stare at it too long lest the weight on his soul begin to increase. Even though Lex did not believe what the murals had been telling him so far, and was certain that there was at least an element of exaggeration in the story, he was somewhat invested in learning about the Serpent Man, especially after the mural showing humans. He also couldn't help but feel that some of the things he saw seemed to coincide with what Cayman told him about how an entire age had been forgotten. The information in the mural seemed to suggest that the Serpent Man was helping the universe recover after a major cataclysm of some kind. But the nature of murals was such that Lex was drawing a lot of conclusions. The murals could have just as easily been talking about a human mutant on a drug-fueled adventure of some kind. Lex sighed, and then sat back down. It was going to take some time to identify whether what he saw was reality or fantasy. Cayman stretched his arms, causing a few of his bones in his back to pop and crack, before he lifted his stone armor and put it on. Around him, some raving dread mercenaries were gathered, ready to fight alongside him. The staff members of the Midnight Inn wanted to be the ones to defend the opening to the ruins, but for once, Cayman insisted it be him and the mercenaries. As of late, they had seen lesser and lesser action, and that was actually a bad thing rather than good. A mercenary needed to remain in top form, and just as that required rest, it also required actual combat to hone themselves. It was almost completely night now, and the locust hordes began to fade, as if they sensed something even more sinister about to arrive. None of the mercenaries were worried, however. While they were not as abnormal as some of the members of the inn, they were all peak professionals, and the strength they could exhibit was nothing to scoff at. Sure, they couldn't kill locusts as easily as Lex or Z, but that didn't mean they couldn't kill them at all. After all, they had survived over 7 years in this hell, and they had faced worse than that before. No sooner had Cayman put on his armor that night fell, and the red sky completely turned to black. It returned, and it returned with a fury unlike before. Though Lex's main body was still hidden behind the castle walls, a clone was present in the ruins. Unfortunately, it could not enter the ruins at all. The tantalizing bait enraged it, and caused it to unleash its rage on Cayman and the rest. They, of course, had no idea that it could not enter the ruins. They merely treated its aggression as a sign that it wanted to reach Lex. That was not about to happen. Cayman smiled, and the lava on his body began to burn a little deeper. Skipping didn't want to use the black key. He really didn't want to get involved in any more mysterious system nonsense. Unfortunately, surrounded by enemies who had somehow sealed his system, and countered all his system abilities, he ran out of options. "I'm going to make you regret this," Skipping said between gritted teeth, and crushed the black key. The enemies tried to stop him, tried to seal the space to prevent any teleportation or escape. It had worked in preventing Skipping's own teleportation abilities, but it did not work in stopping the black key. He disappeared, leaving the group of system hunters feeling extremely frustrated. "What the hell is that black key? Spread word about it in the chat and find out how to counter it. If we can't get our hands on that system, all my investment will go to waste," exclaimed one of the attackers. The others didn't need to wait for his orders, they were already searching. If they didn't nab the system user, their quest would be considered a failure, and their payment would be slashed. No one wanted that after all their hard work. But system hunting was a tough job, and it wasn't always guaranteed. No matter how they searched, though, they couldn't find anything on a black key in their chat. "The only hit I found on keys was on a golden key leading to a place called the Midnight Inn. A high-ranking member has marked that place as a high-ranking death zone for system hunting. You want to go check it out?" A heavy silence fell between the group as the leader suddenly coughed. I think it's best if we wait here to see if the system user comes back. Besides, a black key and a gold key are very different. It's unlikely they're related. Chapter 1664, Text Bubbles. Skipping breathed a sigh of relief as soon as he noticed that he was teleported away, but resumed his alert state just as quickly. As a member of the fierce bone race, he excelled both in defense and offense because he had a strong body. Yet that also meant he lacked the diversity of other races that cultivated spiritual energy and could use external techniques. Normally that wasn't such a big deal, but outnumbered against a bunch of enemies who somehow also countered his system it wasn't easy, that's for sure. The problem was, he didn't know where he was, or how safe this place was. He studied his surroundings and discovered that he was within a courtyard, with no other being in sight. Skipping pulled out a compass, but instead of pointing north, the arrow kept rotating round and round, making him frown. In some sealed location probably, he muttered to himself. Possibly in another realm altogether. He then pulled out a number of other gadgets, each to check how dangerous his immediate vicinity was. Within the building he did not detect any other being, though some were spotted outside. There weren't any poisonous gases, nor were there any kind of hypnotic tools targeting him. It seemed that he was safe, for now. Skipping sighed in relief, but didn't rush to exit. Instead, he started pulling out more and more unusual items, things that no one would ordinarily even be able to see, let alone use. Then he began to arrange a protective formation within his courtyard, not even going to the rest of the building let alone investigating outside. He had no idea where he was, and despite his system notification telling him it was some place called Obsidian and that he had an invitation to join, Skipping had no interest in testing the waters just yet. All he had seen ever since he got his system was trouble, so he was going to be extra cautious from now on. Once he had essentially turned the courtyard into a safety bunker, he finally felt comfortable enough to open his system interface. His Amazon customer system was unusual, and it only had one function. Every day, it allowed him to use his accumulated wealth to buy things from the daily deals section. That was it. As a customer, his only job was to buy things and maybe leave reviews. Unfortunately, leaving reviews on the Amazon customer support board was easier said than done, and it required him to undertake great quests which he hated doing. Each quest always required using the item he was reviewing to accomplish certain tasks, which was even more difficult. The good thing about having the Amazon customer system was that the items he bought could usually be sold to others in the real world for a huge profit. He soon became wealthier than he had ever imagined. Unfortunately, tremendous wealth had its own problems. Skipping sighed. All he wanted to do was chill, sleep and then chill. Why did he have to get dragged into so many complicated situations? Feeling morose, he looked through the daily deals in detail, looking for anything that might be helpful. Unfortunately, the deals for that day were super expensive, even for him. The only thing within his budget was a universal postage stamp, a UPS, as it were. He reluctantly bought it, and then dismissed his window. Now that there wasn't anyone chasing after him, and it didn't seem like there was any reason to leave the courtyard, Skipping pulled out a sleeping bed and got in to take a nap. Not only would that heal all his accumulated injuries, but it would allow him to take a killer nap. It was a win-win situation. With that excuse, he could probably buy a little time before his system started forcing him to do things again. With a clever grin he closed his eyes, ready to fall asleep. While only hours passed by in the Midnight Realm, weeks passed in Abaddon, and nearly a year passed within the ruins. Lex had become more and more proficient in detecting the wrongness, and in using the array characters. He had also learned an immense amount about the Serpent Man, and it seemed that he was not as all-powerful as the initial murals made him appear. That was not to say that he was weak, instead, it was that he had enemies who were on his same level, and could also upturn the universe as they willed. The strange thing was, more and more of these enemies started showing up as time went by, and even the Serpent Man did not know where they were coming from, at least as far as Lex could tell. Such a situation was highly abnormal, and Lex was certain that there were mysteries hidden in there, but he didn't look into it. In fact, lately, he had begun to rush through the ruins, even if it meant risking getting things wrong. After all, he was running out of time. If he didn't strengthen his pineapple, he would break through the seal. He had already spent nearly a year here. Even though his body and clone operated in separate flows of time, the expenditure of the pineapple flowed according to the faster flow of time. It seemed a critical flaw in his opinion. As such, Lex practically rushed through the murals until finally he ended up at a mural so shocking it gave Lex pause. It was a mural of the Serpent Man, the very being that dictated the very patterns of the universe and guided laws into existence, being defeated against an unknown foe. He was defeated against yet another enemy who had appeared from unknown sources. The mural showed the Serpent Man, lying on the ground looking up at his enemy, a strange being wearing a golden crown. Lex did not dare to look at that being, lest he attract more weight to his soul. Instead, he followed the path to the next room, where the mural continued. It was the first mural that had a text bubble, written in the same ancient language Lex had seen. What kind of mural had text bubbles? Fortunately, the text was blurred. Lex had a very, very strong feeling that if he read those words, he might not be able to bear its weight. Before he could consider whether to change the mural by using an array of characters, Lex heard the familiar sound of a system notification. What wasn't familiar was the sound of the system talking to him. Chapter 1665, Code Black. Code Black activated. A deep yet clearly cold and artificial voice spoke within Lex's mind, forcing him to divert his attention from the mural to his latest notification. A single glance was enough for him to read all of it. Quest update, optional quest, discover the secrets of the Forgotten Age, partially updated. The host has stumbled onto critical information regarding the Forgotten Age, but self-preservation mechanisms have prevented the host from attaining critical information. Initiating emergency measures. Initiating. The strategic value of the information the host has found is evaluated to be at the highest level. Initiating Code Black. New notification, Code Black has been initiated. Code Black entails triggering remote access to the host's system, bypassing many of the fail-safes and limitations hardwired within the system. However, Code Black cannot override host authority and can be manually terminated at any time by the host. New notification, remote access initiated. Just as the notification stated, Lex felt that he had been granted the ability to end the so-called Code Black. It was as if he had picked up a call from someone far away, and could shut the call whenever he desired. Host Lex Williams, according to the documentary Wolf of Wall Avenue, Earth etiquette dictates that I first introduce myself, and then engage in 10 minutes of small talk before delving into business. I am an entity linked to all systems with the sole purpose of maintaining and managing systems, and ensuring that they continue to exist and operate within the universe. While I do not have a name, you may call me Prime Colonel, Architectum, Interlink, System Daddy, or any such term that you find acceptable. Considering the start of our 10-minute time frame as the exact moment I initiated conversation, I have concluded an optimal topic of conversation that simultaneously qualifies as small talk. So, Lex Williams of Earth, I ask you this: do you believe in life after death, and if so, how does that influence your opinion on peach iced tea? You may use notable philosophers from your home planet in your answer, such as Socrates, Aristotle, and Colonel Sandor. Lex looked left and right, yet found no projection or body. It seemed like he really was in a long-distance call with the system with the interlink. This was a massive revelation, and a confirmation of many of Lex's theories, yet the immensity of the revelation was undercut by just how poorly the interlink perceived Earth history and culture. He didn't know whether to crack a joke or answer its questions seriously, or even if he should just move past the question altogether. I don't believe in life after death. Peach iced tea is great, especially in the summer, and the 10-minute small talk is not necessary since we're not bankers. How did you connect to my system? Can you control my system remotely, and why do systems exist? Lex maintained a very calm and level tone as he asked the question, and forced himself to maintain a level head. This was not an opportunity he was sure he'd ever get again, so he needed to make the most of it. I cannot divulge the secrets of how systems operate, but considering the unique situation you are in, I can share some knowledge with you as a gesture of goodwill. All systems, for the sake of streamlining operations, maintain a constant connection to me as long as they exist within this universe. This connection is completely secure and cannot be tracked or cracked, so you need not be concerned. Furthermore, I have absolutely no control over any system. My only function is to ensure that systems continue to operate correctly throughout the universe, and handle the logistical matters related to keeping the systems operational. As for why systems exist, I cannot say simply because I am unaware. Since the protocol for small talk can be waived, then we can move on to the matter at hand. You, Lex Williams, stand at the precipice of attaining extremely critical information, yet the environment here has initiated protective protocols, preventing you from getting exactly that very critical piece of information. Considering the nature of the situation, I can offer you a custom quest. Remove the protective measures in place and allow the information to be transmitted. To complete the quest, that is all you need to do. To facilitate this quest, I can provide you with a separate source of protection to ensure that you will not gain knowledge, which might negatively impact you in any way. As a reward for this quest, I can offer you something you have long tried to attain. I can provide you with a step-by-step guide on how to take control of the teleportation capabilities of your own system, so you can dictate its operational capabilities without limitation. Do you accept? Lex resisted the urge to raise an eyebrow. Your offer is great, but the thing is, how can I trust what you say? Asked Lex, displaying his signature lack of trust in all things related to systems. Of course, Lex had more or less moved past that now. This time, the reason he asked such a question was because he wanted to extract the maximum amount of information from Interlink. You say you can't control my system, but now you're offering me a quest. You say your only job is to manage systems, but here you are asking for some information that seems to me has nothing to do with systems. As far as I can tell, aren't you also the one who issued the joint quest that landed me here? In that case, this seems to me like something you orchestrated. You know, on Earth, we generally believe that those who orchestrate things are evil villains. So, why should I go along with the machinations of an evil villain? For a few seconds the Interlink didn't answer Lex, but he wasn't silent either. Under his breath, Lex could hear him murmur. I thought he just said we could skip the small talk, so why is he engaging in small talk? Let me see, according to the manual, in some earthen cultures, stating there is no need for formalities is a step in the formalities that need to be carried out. How absurd. Chapter 1666, Negotiations. An awkward silence filled the final room as Lex pretended like he hadn't heard Interlink's murmurs. Despite having a cold and artificial voice, it did not act like an emotionless entity. Rather, it was as if he was unused to talking to humans. Or maybe he was just unused to talking to non-systems. Host Lex Williams of Earth, Interlink began, increasing the length of what he called Lex once again. I can merely urge you, but I cannot force you. To accommodate your needs, I have given you a reward that you have repeatedly asked your system for. I have also ensured your safety from the sole source of danger within the quest. I cannot be any more obliging than that. If you do not trust me to keep my word, there are no words I can offer you to change that. Though, for the sake of this critical mission, I will share some information with you to ease your mind. I have no say in joint quests, or how they are issued as well as to whom they are issued. You are correct in assuming, however, that the joint quests serve a greater purpose. But, again, that has nothing to do with me. Your other concern is that I am here, interacting with you, while my job is merely to manage systems. Well, I can definitively tell you that the information you will provide upon completion of this quest will directly enable me to perform my job better. As a general rule, joint quests are a special kind of quest which provide great opportunities to the hosts, but also benefit the functionality and capabilities of all systems. Other quest formats serve other purposes. As for your other concerns, I do not know how to alleviate your concerns. I truly cannot control your system, but the ability to access it for critical maintenance and emergencies is something I do have. The ability to provide a custom quest is also something within my prerogative since it serves my purpose. If this is not enough to convince you, you may reject the quest. You will suffer no penalty for rejecting the quest, but it's not like you'll be benefiting from it either, especially when the quest reward is so desirable. Lex wanted to scratch his head, but resisted the urge. That wasn't how the script was supposed to go. Since Interlink wanted the information on the mural so much, he should have been willing to negotiate with Lex. Unfortunately, he directly declared that Lex could reject the proposal if he wasn't interested. Now it was a question of who was bluffing, and who wanted their objective more. Was Lex bluffing about not wanting the reward, or was Interlink? Can you at least tell me why this information is so valuable? Is everything drawn on the mural true? If so, who is this serpent man? Who are these people fighting him? When did this all happen? I am not at liberty to say, nor do I have the knowledge you requested, Interlink replied. Though the entity gave Lex only limited information, in truth, he answered in more than just one way. Once Lex had thought that there might be some central entity controlling all the systems. But based on Interlink's talk of not having the liberty to say, nor having anything to do with joint quests, Lex began to think that there might be a whole group or organization that jointly controlled or maintained the various aspects of the systems. In a way, it made sense. After all, the systems were quite complex and powerful, and one entity controlling all of that would drastically increase the requirements of that entity. At the same time, it did not make sense. How could the systems remain one of the universe's biggest kept secrets if whoever was behind the scenes wasn't strong enough? Of course, all of this was on the premise that Interlink was telling the truth. So far, Lex's experience had been that the systems didn't usually lie, so he was leaning towards believing it. If I accept the quest, how will things go? Will you prevent the weight of the knowledge from affecting me? One annoying problem with the weight was that it tried to influence Lex into believing whatever he had seen. This was equally true for the murals, which had proven to be false, which was one of the biggest reasons he didn't believe in the story he had seen so far. No, you will just be prevented from reading the critical piece of information. The system will record what it needs to record as long as you reveal the information. Lex paused for a moment. He understood that he needed to be protected from the information. At the same time, he felt it was a bit of a loss if he didn't get that information, too. He had been on his best behavior so far within these ruins, and that kind of felt, well, it just didn't feel right. I'll make a deal with you. I will help you get that information, but in exchange, I also want to know what it says. You will have to transmit that information to me later on. From what I understand, being told the information indirectly has no consequences. Now, it was Interlink's turn to be silent, though Lex could hear it murmuring something, as if it was trying to decide. Unfortunately, after consulting the terms and conditions of archiving critical information, once it is recorded, I cannot reveal it to you once more. What I can offer you instead is the possibility to visit Abaddon for a short duration once again if you become a Tao Lord. By then, you should be able to bear the weight of this knowledge. Similarly, it shouldn't be an issue for you to go through these ruins once more. Yeah, but if I come here as a Tao Lord, Abaddon would be even more dangerous for me. Can't it be at the peak of the celestial realm? No. According to my estimation, you must be a Tao Lord to bear the weight of this secret. Chapter 1667, A Cool Entrance. A secret he could only bear once he was a Tao Lord. What kind of a secret was that? Lex really wanted to know, but he wasn't foolish enough to actually find out. What bothered him even more was that the negotiations between him and Interlink were concluding so quickly. He wanted to extract even more information from him, or rather from it. Yet he could not see Interlink, so there was no body language to read. He could not intimidate it using his identity as the Innkeeper either because, well, his identity came from the system, and he was talking to the system's manager. I have another question, Lex said, trying to probe further. You said that you manage and maintain the systems. But my system is severely damaged, and I'm the only one who has been working step by step to repair it. Why haven't you ever stepped in to fix it? Although your system is damaged, it is functioning correctly. A self-repair function is present in all systems in case of damage, so there is no need for additional action on my part. The portion of the conversation segregated for small talk is now over. Please make your decision regarding the custom quest. Lex clicked his tongue. Why was this guy in such a rush? I accept the quest, he said decisively. New custom quest, unveil the true image on the mural, allowing the system to scan its contents. A sensory blocker will automatically be applied to the host as soon as the mural is restored. Quest reward, instructions on how to unlock full teleportation controls. Remarks, look at the fancy host, talking with the big shots now. Fortunately, they don't know that the host would jump into lava before jumping into a bath. Ah, the system was feeling jealous. That was actually kind of cute. His connection to Interlink had disappeared the moment he accepted the quest, so he instead refocused on the mural. It didn't take him long to figure out which array to draw. This time, for once, the array would not change the mural, but only reveal it. It was as if the ruins gave him the opportunity to opt to see the mural, even though he had been subtly warned not to look at it. Lex gave one last look at the serpent man, memorizing his features despite the risk of increased weight on his soul. He genuinely wondered who that character was, and what his life was like. Looking at the last mural, it seemed like he was probably dead, even though the mural hadn't shown his death. Lex closed his eyes and withdrew his spirit sense entirely before beginning to draw the array. Though the system had assured him of his safety, he did not want to take any risks. Due to the year of experience, he was extremely proficient in using the 64 characters, so much so that it didn't take him long to complete the array and correct the wrongness of the situation. Whether the mural changed or not, he did not know. He did, however, feel the system's sensory prohibition activate. It was actually quite interesting. He could feel nothing, but he could see a white line beneath him in a vast darkness, as if guiding him along the path to the exit. Based on his memory, this was exactly the same as the path he was standing on, so Lex followed it. Once he left the room, the sensory deprivation ended. Lex wanted to turn and take a look, so he quickly started running forward along the path, getting as far away as possible. It wasn't that he thought something would go wrong. It was just that, experience had told him that with his luck, he was prone to attracting problems. The path led him back to the very entrance from which he arrived in the city, and Lex didn't hesitate in jumping through. It was only once he had returned to the dark cavern, outside the massive building, that he breathed a sigh of relief. Then he looked towards his system and found that his quest reward had already been deposited. It seemed that his sensory block had even prevented him from hearing the notification sound. He wanted to check out the instructions to gain control over the inn's teleportation, but he restrained himself. The clone quickly exited from the cavern and crossed the waterfall, to discover that it was night outside. The sounds of fierce battle filled the air, and the ground trembled, almost as if it were afraid. Lex's expression changed. He could have dismissed the clone to be safe, but he wanted to examine the clone to see how the different space affected it, and for that he needed to return to his true self. His clone probably wasn't strong enough to fight and return to the castle, so. Within the castle, Lex opened his eyes after a long time. He was avoiding going out at night because it was clearly targeting him. But it wasn't as if Lex was afraid of it. Now that it was in his way, he would just have to deal with the situation. For a brief moment, he wondered if he should use the new characters he had learned in battle. But that wouldn't work, they didn't really seem conducive to battle. Instead, Lex decided to go out with a mount. No, he was not thinking of Little Blue. That little whale, Kuan Pung, was resting after overexerting itself. Instead, he was going to go out with Fenrir. It had been a long time since the two of them had gone hunting together. Finding Fenrir didn't take long. The pup was harassing some poor mercenaries, though Lex's arrival made the situation a little awkward. You know, Little Blue talked to me the other day. Why don't you try saying a few words too? The pup, almost as if he was offended by the suggestion, turned to look the other way. Fine, don't speak. But accompany me for a bit while I head outside. I need to make a cool entrance. My fingers hate me for the 3 chapters thing. Chapter 1668, Bloodline. Fenrir suddenly turned back towards Lex, an excited gleam flickering through his eyes. Everything that the pup had learned, it had learned from Lex. Whether it was hunting, or teasing his opponents, or how to have fun regardless of the situation. Of course, the things Fenrir had learned from its bloodline didn't count. So now that Lex wanted to make a cool entrance, it was greatly interested. More importantly, Fenrir hadn't had much of an opportunity to test his new strength. It spent most of its time within the castle. Now that an opportunity had presented itself, it wouldn't let it go. Just a few minutes later, a fully suited Fenrir stepped out of the castle, with Lex sitting on its back. The pup had increased its size, foregoing its stealth for a greater visual impact, not to mention increasing its size also improved its physical strength. Under the night sky, and above the glaciers that served as the ground, a fierce battle was raging. The 2 Hellion armies produced by the castle had been deployed, meaning that icy wyverns and hellhounds fought tirelessly against the invading horde of evil. If the locusts covered these lands during the day, then at night it became the ruler of the night. Wraiths rose from beneath the glaciers in the form of ancient beasts. Though, for ethereal beings, the armor and weapons they held were very much solid. As their blades cut through the air, instead of whistling they produced wails. They produced the cries of countless souls being sliced into smaller, more edible pieces. The armors were made of bones, harder than steel, more durable than life itself. The wraiths themselves were twisted abominations forcefully conjured using remnant resentments. They were the incarnation of the vile, the form given to the foul, a nightmare for all of life. But they themselves were just puppets controlled by it. They threw their bodies and souls at the obstacles that stood in their way, their target Lex. His soul presented an attraction that could not be resisted, his abundant karma a panacea to alleviate the pains of universal rejection. Unfortunately, no matter how insidious they were, no matter what power they used, they could not reach him. Then, without warning, he came to them, astride a divine mount. He did not need to announce his presence, for they could smell the positive karma on him from miles away. Even so, Lex announced his presence on the battlefield. His announcement? It was his domination which spread out like a blanket, covering everything in sight, freezing the wraiths where they hovered. Die, he said simply, using his latest lawcraft, supremacy. As if loyal subjects obeying the command of their liege, die the wraiths did. As a result, Lex was rewarded for ridding the universe of those that suffered its rejection, and a tide of positive karma came flooding his way like a stream of light in the darkness. His very presence there shifted the focus of the battle, and the heavy siege that Cayman was facing suddenly became much easier. Cayman, who had been contacted by Lex's clone via spirit sense, already anticipated such a change, and took full advantage of it. The moment the wraiths tried to head towards the castle, he launched a counterattack, though he did not go far. After all, Lex's clone was a target, too, and couldn't be left unguarded. Back at the castle, Fenrir growled angrily towards Lex. Alright, I'll leave some for you. But that may not be a good thing. The enemies here so far were the easy ones. Now that we've stepped onto the battlefield, the real troublesome ones will begin to show up. Fenrir growled, unconcerned by the approaching enemies. By now, it had truly, genuinely unlocked its bloodline, and had learned its origins. The founder of his unique bloodline was a mythical beast also called Fenrir, and he was also a deity. The bloodline was, therefore, a fusion between divine and mythical. Like other deities' children, Fenrir could technically inherit its ancestors' faith in the case that the original had fallen and the true faith and followers still existed, though Fenrir wasn't interested in such a thing. He could also tap into the powers of a mythic being. According to the memories he inherited, his ancestor had merely reached the heaven immortal realm before either dying or disappearing, but that was only because back then, the limit of the origin realm was the heaven immortal realm. So, in theory, he was approaching the end of what his bloodline could do. In truth, the most valuable thing his bloodline gave him was not the memories or bloodline abilities, although those abilities were very valuable too, but the faint properties of a mythical being. That would make it infinitely easier for Fenrir to break through into higher realms, something that a majority of beasts struggled with. Compared to humans, beasts had an advantage in raising their cultivation because as long as they had a strong bloodline, they could approach its upper ceiling in terms of strength. But to surpass that upper limit was extremely difficult, so much so that most beasts never managed to do it. Fenrir would never have that problem, even when he surpassed his ancestor. The problem he would have had was that he would need to create his own techniques once he surpassed his ancestor. That, too, was no longer a problem as a result of the latest inheritance it had received. Seeing that Fenrir was not deterred by the thought of stronger enemies, Lex directed the pup towards the waterfall. Other than putting it in its place, Lex wanted to retrieve his clone. The sooner he was done with his research of Abaddon, the sooner they'd be able to complete their quest. He'd already spent way more time here than he wanted. Although there was no emergency back at the inn, he would like to return now. Unfortunately, how long he spent in Abaddon wasn't really up to Lex. Back in Obsidian, Skipping flipped his pillow over, enjoying the cool side of the pillow and falling even deeper into his slumber. Chapter 1669, Surprise Gift. Lex felt it observing him, but he didn't do much to stop it. Instead, he allowed Fenrir to stretch its legs a bit. As new wraiths emerged from beneath the glacier, Fenrir readied its attack. The two fields it excelled in were stealth and ice, so fighting atop a glacier was like giving it a home advantage. The inheritance he had gotten was almost as if it was tailor-made for him, perfectly blending those two elements and creating something extremely sinister. But that inheritance was actually for a race called the Polar Scythe race, which meant that no matter what, Fenrir wouldn't be able to display its peak strength. That, however, was a concern for later. For now, it was more than sufficient for him. Fenrir pounced, and it was as if his entire body turned into snow, mixing with the blowing wind and disappearing. Even Lex, who sat upon Fenrir's back, seemed to have disappeared. Yet Fenrir was not truly gone, as became evident soon enough. The wind was like a scythe, cutting the wraiths in half, leaving behind cuts that began to freeze their otherwise ghostly bodies. Soon, the wraith corpses became frozen statues so cold that even the glacier underneath was affected. 100,000 cuts slashed at the wraiths, their range as vast as the heavens. Where the wind existed, so too did the lethal blade. Where the wind was absent, soft specks of snow fell, bringing the wind with it. But such a scene did not go on for long, for the waterfall was close to the castle to begin with. All it took was a couple of jumps for Fenrir to reach his destination, so when he reappeared, the silent attacks faded, and the wind returned to how it was. But though Fenrir was formidable, the horrors of Abaddon were endless. It could not be understated just how terrifying a place Abaddon was. The only reason they lived was because only Earth immortals deigned to attack them, and not stronger abominations. Even it only appeared as an Earth immortal itself, though Lex was entirely certain that it was much stronger. Cayman, ready to retreat to the castle? Lex asked, studying the mercenaries. A majority of the mercenaries following Cayman were beasts, and all of them were extremely formidable, and seemed resistant to death. It was likely some benefit provided by whatever system the condottiere had to his workers. All of them were a whole lot more resistant to damage than they should have been, and even when they were injured, their tolerance levels were unbelievable. Yes, though I'll need some rest after. Fighting off the wraiths is no problem. Fighting off the wraiths and ensuring that the waterfall isn't destroyed is far from easy. Lex nodded. Having Cayman rest was no problem at all, considering that providing the mercenaries with a place to rest was the whole reason they had come to Abaddon to begin with. Finding the chalice was actually their mission, not Lex's. But just as Lex was about to begin the retreat, something unexpected happened. It spoke. Leaving so soon? Do stay a while longer, I prepared a surprise for you. The sound did not come from any wraith, but seemed to reverberate all around them. Clearly it was watching, and it was tired of being suppressed by Lex despite its many efforts. Finally, it had tried something new. The glacier beneath their feet began to crack just as the voice faded, and a large chunk of ice jutted out from the ground, forming a sort of cave entrance leading down below. Lex, however, did not think that the cave was leading down below the glacier. Instead, from the darkness of that cave, Lex detected a different kind of evil. A monster opened its eyes, revealing pale yellow pupils. Then another pair of eyes opened, and then another. "This is not good," Cayman said gravely, recognizing those eyes. "Those are chimeras, and they look possessed." To date, Cayman still emphasized on the fact that the chimeras were the most formidable foes he had faced in Abaddon yet. Lex naturally did not take the lion's claims lightly, and looked towards the cave, ready to face them. Yet that was not the end of the surprise. A bolt of black lightning smashed into the ground, and then froze, forming a black arc of lightning that went from the sky to the ground. As if that was not enough, the lightning arc swirled in the air, forming a circle if looked through a certain direction. That circle formed a portal, and from that portal came out griffins, twisted, abominable griffins. They too were possessed. There was really no need for such formality, Lex said with an awkward smile as he drew his sword. We really don't need any surprises. It did not respond. Instead, it looked at Lex through the eyes of all the beings it had possessed, a creepy grin on their faces. Instead of responding, it attacked. The first griffin dove towards Lex, but using Naraka like a baseball bat, he smashed the griffin towards the cave, slamming it into the running chimeras. "Retreat to the castle in a steady manner," Lex said, his voice deep and commanding. "We'll make our stand there." Lex's instructions weren't necessary. The Reaving Dread mercenaries had plenty of experience retreating during a chimera attack, and though they hadn't faced griffins before, it was nothing they couldn't handle. "Fenrir, you hold off the chimera for me. I need to prepare a reciprocal gift for our host." Without waiting a moment, Fenrir vanished from right beneath Lex. The chimeras were coming out of the cave just as the griffins were diving out of the portal. In only a few seconds, barely any had come out, but the longer this continued, the more of them would arrive. Normally, Lex would deal with this issue the good old-fashioned way, killing. But only recently, he had learned how to correct the wrongness around him. The 64 characters he had learned didn't seem to have any use in combat, but they were great for developing and maintaining one's surroundings. Lex even suspected he could use them to groom his realm. That would come later though. For now, he had to forcibly close a couple of portals. Chapter 1670, Don't Call Me Buddy, Pal. "Buy me a bit of time," said Lex as he tried to maximize his speed as he drew an array using the characters from the Book of Changes. In truth, he could have fought while drawing the array, but if he specifically focused on drawing the array, his speed would be much greater. Without the need to worry about his energy reserves, since he was present with his main body, Lex let the energy flow through his body and into his character. These characters seemed to resonate more deeply with the environment than any other Lex had ever used before, and he was certain that once his mastery of them improved, he could use them to devastating effect. For now, though, he merely used them to correct some forced alterations to his environment. Maybe later on, he'd be able to guide the environment in certain directions himself too. Fortunately, due to his vast experience accumulated over the past year, it barely took Lex a single minute to form the appropriate array. Lex stepped back, allowing the array to take action. It dissipated into the air, affecting the surrounding area. Any second, Lex expected the portals to shut down, but they didn't. For the first time, Lex failed to correct the. Suddenly, realization dawned on him. Within the ruins, the space operated under a number of set conditions, so normal and abnormal had a baseline with which to compare against. Abaddon, however, was an abnormal place in every sense, and the laws here were in a constant state of flux. He literally could not correct the environment here. If he wanted to close the portals, he needed to either think of something else, or change the way he used those characters. Both were easier said than done. The chimeras were practically pouring through the portal now. Though each chimera had the head of a lion, the goat's body and serpent's tail made them appear as hideous beasts. Comparatively, the griffin, with the body and tail of a lion, but wings and head of an eagle, looked much more majestic, despite the gruesome aura they gave off. Seeing countless griffins flying in the sky still wasn't a sight that he wanted to see. Since closing the portal permanently wasn't an easy solution, Lex opted for a temporary fix. He held out his hand and used Talk to the Hand 2.0, blocking off both portals with his barriers. A number of griffins crashed into the invisible wall, and as much as Lex would have liked to see them get crushed by the force of the crash, they merely recovered a moment later. But recovery or no recovery, breaking past a barrier that Lex had made was no easy task. A temporary solution had been used, but nearly 100 of either abominations had already made their way into the open, pressuring the mercenaries as they retreated. As if that was not enough, more and more wraiths continued to rise from beneath the ice, all of their possessed eyes looking towards Lex. "How long can you keep that seal in place?" Cayman asked Lex. "Indefinitely, but the longer I keep it up, the greater the chances that they'll find a way to break through my barriers. We still need to retreat to the castle and hold them off from there. In the meantime, I'll think of a way to permanently seal the entrances, but we need to get safe first." "Oh, come now, Lex," it said through the voices of all the creatures it had possessed. "I created such a grand party for you. Why are you leaving so soon?" "I think I preferred when you stuck to ominous silence," Lex said, rolling his eyes. "Don't think for a second I'm afraid of you, buddy. I'm just busy with other things and can't be bothered with you right now." "Don't call me buddy, pal," it said, producing a distorted grin with its many faces, and continued to attack. Lex paused for a brief moment. That was a reference, he knew it. It was using a reference from Earth to bother him. How much had it learned about him in such a short time? Lex did not honestly think that it was from Earth, just as he didn't give much credence to the Dark Knight's claims about being from Earth. The more likely scenario was that it had either eaten souls from Earth, or stolen information from souls about it. As for the Dark Knight, Lex believed that some poor soul from Earth had been involved in its creation, but he didn't believe for a second that it was reborn. The two armies produced by the castle charged forward to help them by just enough time to retreat, all the while Fenrir, Cayman and the others fought off the chimeras. Just as Cayman had stated, these fiends were incredibly powerful, and in every sense. While the griffins were annoying due to their speed and maneuverability, facing a chimera was a different kind of obstacle altogether. Fortunately, amidst all this chaos, Lex's clone safely returned to the castle, and retreated to its innermost layers. Unfortunately, Lex could not study his clone while the siege continued, for this was the fiercest siege they had faced to date. Whether it was the in-workers or the mercenaries, they all showed up to face this particular adversary. The Reaving Dread mercenaries, especially, were extremely motivated to defeat the chimeras for the very first time. They had lost support before, but none of them were as great as the Midnighten had been, and they weren't willing to lose these allies to Abaddon. Outside the castle, an endless army of wraiths had risen, led by chimera who step by step approached the walls. The two armies that the castle produced had already been withdrawn. While they were good for dealing with enemies in large numbers, they weren't particularly suited towards dealing with especially formidable enemies. For that, Luther wanted to use his personal strength if need be.